stream audience. I'm sorry we're a couple minutes late coming on, but if you're listening live, glad you're here. If you're listening later on, well, it doesn't matter. So we are continuing in the Bible study discussion, and the discussion sometimes is more than the reading of the Bible, but that's okay. I'm Pastor Lou Kilgore. I'm pastor here at the High Mountain Presbyterian Church, and we're in Franklin Lakes, and I'm glad that our signal is reaching you. And say hello to our Zoom audience as well. I'm glad that you guys are here, and we can do this. Look at us. We have grown in technology so much. I'm relaxed about this.
That's great.
What do I know? So we have people who are remote and at home. We have one person who's listening who's driving on the road, or was.
Right.
Maybe she's home by now.
No, I'm off the road now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm home.
And so, where are we at today?
11.
Isaiah chapter 11.
Yeah.
We're still in the beginning of what's called First Isaiah. Some of the best parts of Isaiah are in the early chapters, in my opinion. Not supposed to have an opinion like that, I guess, but I do. Okay. So, why don't we just start
Reading.
by reading and see where it takes us, okay?
Do we want to ask Barbara?
Yeah, Barbara, do you want to read?
I need to still get my Bible, so
All right.
it might be better if
I will.
someone else does
I don't
today.
Go
mind.
ahead. Yep.
The King of Peace is coming. A branch will grow from a stump of a tree that was cut down, so a new king will come from the family of Jesse. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon that king. The Spirit gives him wisdom, understanding, guidance, and power. And the Spirit teaches him to know and respect the Lord. The king will be glad to obey the Lord. He will not judge by the way things look. He will not judge by what people say. He will judge the poor honestly. He will be fair in his decisions for the poor people of the land. At his command, evil people will be punished. By his words, the wicked will be put to death. Goodness and fairness will give him strength. They will be like a belt around his waist. The wolves will live in peace with lambs, and the leopards will lie down to rest with goats. Calves, lions, and young bulls will eat together, and a little child will lead them. Cows and bears will eat together in peace. Their young will lie down together. Lions will eat hay as oxen do. A baby will be able to play near a cobra's hole. A child will be able to put his hand into the nest of a poisonous snake. They will not hurt or destroy each other on all my holy mountain. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the sea is full of water. At that time, the new king from the family of Jesse will stand as a banner for the people. The nations will come together around him, and the place where he lives will be filled with glory. At that time, the Lord will again reach out and take his people who are left alive. These are God's people who are left alive in Assyria, North Egypt, South Egypt, Cush, Elam, Babylonia, Hamath, and all the islands of the sea. God will raise a banner as a sign for all people. He will gather the people of Israel who were forced from their country. He will gather the scattered people of Judah from all the parts of the earth. At that time, Israel will not be jealous anymore. Judah will have no enemies left. Israel will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not hate Israel. But Israel and Judah will attack the Philistines on the west. Together they will take the riches from the people of the east. They will conquer Edom and Moab, and the people of Ammon will be under their control. The Lord will dry up the Red Sea of Egypt. He will wave his arm over the Euphrates River. He will dry it up with a scorching wind. He will divide it into 7 small rivers, and people will be able to walk across them with their sandals on. So God's people who are left alive will have a way to leave Assyria. It will be like the time the Israelites went out of Egypt.
Okay. So what do you think?
Sound very good. We got to, we were gonna go conquer again, you know.
Right.
Very strange.
Yes.
There's a lot of good news in the prediction for the people of Israel. My ears were drawn to Israel will not be jealous of Judah, and Judah will not be jealous of Israel. The civil war will come to an end in their peaceable accommodation of each other. I don't know what to think about this. I love the introductory chapter, or verses about the vision of what it's like when the true God of the heavens will move on the face of the earth. And the good news for the poor, the promise of justice, the overwhelming promise of justice in the courts, and that what's just will be just, and that people will not suffer just because they're poor and they can't afford expensive lawyers. I mean, all these things are wrapped up in this vision, and don't you dream of that as well? Don't we
Yes.
all, you know,
Yes.
don't we all
Yes.
carry a
Yes.
vision for a day where that might be what it's like? And of course then, yeah, I have a dream, exactly, I have a dream. And what continues in the second part, which seems strange, is it's good news for all the people of the earth except the Assyrians and and
Yeah.
those
Here we
who have
go.
invaded and done terrible things to these people, that, you know, God is going to reward them in equal punishment. I guess that flows in Isaiah's mind out of justice. That somehow that is the result of justice. What does it mean for the Assyrians to be dealt with justly? Well, they need to be whipped. They need to be put back in their place. They have caused great atrocities to the people of Israel. They have, you know, tried in every way they could to annihilate and destroy them. And so in response to that, God is going to come, and this idea that there will be a branch, there will be a remnant.
Right.
The image of the tree getting chopped off, Assyria chopped off the tree. And that's a tree of the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, all that idea of, you know, the house of Jesse. Yes, Jesse was the place where the prophet went to find the new king when Saul was a king. And Jesse had, 7 or 8 sons. And then that great story about, don't you have another son? Well, yes, I have a little boy who's out in the field, but he's not much. And then David, you know, is discovered, and then he's anointed by Samuel. Samuel anoints him king even while there already is a king. But, you know, it goes back to this whole idea that the kingship of David is, in their recollection, is their own recollection of their great Charlemagne. It's their great time. It's the greatest time in the history of the people. Can I just say, I mean, come on, let's look at the record. It was great for who?
And not even all the Israelites, because they warred among themselves. So, I mean, it was, you know, might is right, and if we can put you down, we will. And there was no righteousness, it seemed, to any of it. It just,
No, and the whole warning from Samuel, the prophet Samuel, was, you get a king, you're going to experience the tyranny of a king. He's going to draft your children into the army. He's going to make big armies. He's going to accumulate wealth for himself. And he's going to take you into war. And guess what? That's exactly what happened.
is that why they had to discredit Samuel and Saul before? And then, because, you know, there's a lot of awful stuff about them.
Yeah, there is. And again, I know it's not fair, I guess, in terms of fairness to the text, but I think the story speaks louder than the text. Saul was rejected as a king, and I keep going back to this. Why? They hired him as the king. They thought he was God's anointed because he was tall, and he was handsome, and he looked like a warrior.
Well, there we go.
He looked like a warrior. And in the end, I mean, I try to think, in times like this, I try to think of the most dramatic thing I can say. It's almost like he turned out to be gay.
He turned out to be
He was a peaceable man.
maybe not so bold and bloodthirsty as they would have wanted.
Yeah.
Didn't fit the physical, but perhaps, I would think, he probably would have been a better king if he had been able to stay a little longer. Who knows? We don't know now.
No, and the record shows that he kind of lost his mind. He went crazy, and who wouldn't? Because he was being hunted by his one-time companion and trusted loyal sidekick, David, who now is hunting him with an army of very skilled men and chasing him around, seeking to kill him.
Telling everybody God's telling me to do that.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Saul's own son is loyal to David. I mean, the story is, it's great. It's a great story for, the Game of Thrones kind of story. It's a wonderful, wonderful story, but it does not endear me. I'm not ultimately endeared to Saul. I admire his sense that is there in the very beginning, which was he was not a bloodthirsty king. He was not. They wanted a king for self-defense. They wanted self-defense. And he does enter into a battle when they're being invaded. He forgets to ask Samuel to pray before the battle begins. And therefore, that's it. Samuel writes him off.
It sounds like they had to really hunt to find something to get.
Yep.
To get him.
Yeah, and, but we don't know. I mean, it's coming down this way. Who knows who added to the story, who, might
Right.
have spun it a certain way. But in the end, they can't get away from this idea of David because he was mighty.
Yeah, he was
In other
mighty.
words, he was bloodthirsty.
Yeah, and
He is the one to carry on this tradition.
Are you back? You're
And
back
it
now.
seems so incongruous that you would want to link Jesus.
Yeah, now in Bible study.
For peace to this warlike king. And yet, it's always emphasized that Jesus comes from the lineage of David.
Always.
right, so the prophets, the bards told about David. I think this is the reason they keep coming back to David. David's reign, his dynasty came to an end. It came to an end. And that was not supposed to happen. The promise from the prophets to David when he was anointed was, you or your children will reign in Israel for 1,000 years. And of your dynasty, there will be no end. And you will be the king of kings. Like the stories, the accolades laid at David's feet were huge, and almost all the credibility of spirituality was put upon him. It was almost like as if some trace of David's lineage doesn't become king again, then God is a liar. And that everything we've believed in is false. And so when the Assyrians come, and David's lineage came to an end because the civil war between the north and the south almost completely decimated the community, if you want to call it that, the people of God. And then they made separate allies. The northern kingdom made allies with enemies. They made allies of the Assyrians for a while. And the southern kingdom made allies out of the Egyptians. And they gathered their forces, they got military weapons and soldiers to come in, and they fought until they weakened their own community so badly that when the Syrians came, they marched in with almost no resistance at all. And now, here, Isaiah is saying, yeah, it's bad. It's really bad, but there will be survivors. There will be. Some of you have fled to Egypt. Some of you have fled to, you hear the reference, and you still are heirs of the promise. You are still heirs of the promise of God, and the time will come again when God's justice. Now God's justice. What is God's justice? The Assyrians shouldn't have done this. It wasn't fair. This was an invasion of a nation, and torturous and brutal, and I mean, the Assyrians were one thing, the Babylonians were another. They were both very brutal, conquering nations.
And who wasn't?
And who was it? Which nation is not? So when Isaiah starts pouring out this whole idea of the justice of God and the compassion for the poor and the dispossessed and the people who have no standing, there is, okay, that's the God of the Bible we recognize, who's always on the side of the oppressed. But to what extent does the pendulum of God swing back to then destroy the destroyers? Like, at what point is that really God's justice, or is it just the human need for revenge? Because it seems to me that push of the swing of the pendulum back, which is, you brutalized us, and you did all this, and you destroyed us, but ha ha ha, you didn't kill us all. So we're going to come back now, and we are going to then rise up in power. This is the idea of, out of the stump of Jesse, the tree that is cut down, a branch shall grow out of his roots. And that was exciting to the people, that somehow God was being faithful. That's part of what stirred the people in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, because they were looking once again, the Romans had come in and they had done their business. They had oppressed and destroyed. And the word of the prophets is, don't worry, there's going to be a deliverer who's going to come. He's going to come in the line out of Jesse, out of the root of David, in the line of David, and you will call him a Messiah, a deliverer, because God never abandons us completely. So I'm like, okay, I love your faith. I love your faith that God is faithful with you, if not with you, then with your children, your children's children. God is not abandoning you or forgetting you, but then God comes roaring back in all of these images. God comes roaring back in with an army bigger than the oppressor, with one exception. Jesus.
Oh, there we go.
And Luke goes to great lengths to say Jesus is this root. He is this branch that arrives.
Yeah, I don't get it. They're kind of the opposites.
Yeah, because he doesn't do anything of what Isaiah, in this part anyway, figures he's going to do.
He was not the avenger.
No, he was not the avenger.
No,
He was the avenger of, let's see what I want to say. He was the avenger of God's way. Like
He was bringing God's message.
he was bringing God's message.
Comfort to the
Right.
discomfited. And that's not, I don't know, manly enough
No,
or,
yeah, there you go.
And even, I think of all these images of the stories of the Bible, wherever they are, that run through my mind, like the image in the New Testament that's preserved that when they came to arrest Jesus in the garden and Peter cut the ear off one of the soldiers. And here's Jesus. He puts the ear back on and heals the ear. He is the anti-David. He is the anti-image of this one who will come from God. He does not have any of that. And then people, I still think in Christianity today, there's a longing for this kind of, righteousness or vindication to come. So here's what we do. We go, well, Jesus came. He didn't pull out a knife and stab Pilate in his trial. He accepted, in a way, the judgment of Pilate and the decision of Pilate. Pilate says, look, I'm innocent of your death. Well, okay, you're not innocent because you could stop it, but okay. He goes to his death. Isaiah is quoted in that Jesus is now identified not as the branch of David, but as the suffering servant. He suffers like a sheep before its shears is quiet. And so they see Jesus as this suffering servant. Now, maybe I'm talking about too much here, but what emerges when what you thought was going to happen doesn't happen,
Right.
you rework what you thought was going to happen. There's a reworking of the theology that goes on in this decimated community where they keep waiting for the clouds to open and the deliverer to come on the white horse, who's going to kill all their enemies. It doesn't happen. So there's a reworking of theology that takes place, and that is, we'll talk about it more later, but Isaiah begins to talk about it, and that is, it's called not the victorious Savior, but the suffering one of God. And the idea in the theology, in the working out, what's happening, people say to the theologians, the prophets, what is going on? When is God going to deliver us? And they actually, you can hear it begin to emerge, and that is, God is going to save the world through a small remnant. If just a few people will be faithful and will follow the law, and at one point, I'm not quite sure where in the time period, but the rabbis begin to introduce this idea that if just 100 people would obey the law perfectly on one day, then the new world will begin. So don't you be the one that keeps us from the coming new world, the coming world in which God is completely in control.
Well, it's always like even like now, in today's world, it went through my head like about not retaliating against evil or murder and massacre. Like those Amish people who forgave all those at the school where
Right,
the
the guy
children.
that came in and killed the
Yeah,
children.
and the whole world was like, what? Like nobody knows what to do with that, or the mother who visits the murderer of her child in jail and says, I forgive you. I mean, many people say that's, I actually have somebody who said it's probably like a publicity stunt. What kind of publicity stunt?
Right.
But anyway, I said, no, I think this gives us opportunity to rethink about always having to get even. I think we just add to the evil as we go about with that attitude. Oh, I'm going to get you.
So let me, I just want to respond a little bit to the Amish story. I completely agree that we have to ultimately find what it means to give true and meaningful forgiveness. Around the Amish story, I thought was that was not about forgiveness. I think that's about the illness of the Amish community. The Amish community has a very, very difficult time holding anybody accountable for their horrible behavior. And what I mean by that is, especially in the male leadership community, women are abused, they're raped, they're taken advantage of in that community, and when they are, and those young women come to the elders and say, look what this person did to me, do you know what they say?
Your fault?
No, you need to forgive that person and
all
stop
right.
talking about it.
That's that movie, well, it's a Mennonite society, but the movie Women Talking, it's all about a Mennonite society in South America.
Was that a book? That was a book.
I'm not, I don't know, I
Yeah, I
didn't read
think-
it,
I
but
think
it's
we-
an actual, it did happen.
I think we read this in book.
And the discussion in one of the
We
movies
did.
is, we have a few different paths to take here. And of course, they discuss, should we forgive and forget? Should we move on? Should we actually take an active and get out of here? And
Yeah, what do
are
we
we
do?
cursed by our society? And I think, when you're saying the Amish, they forgive, but I think they have a harder time forgiving their own because they have that spring and whatever. They call it.
Rumspringa?
Yeah, there you go. That, they allow the young people to make a choice, but if they make the choice that they don't want them to make, they don't seem to forgive. They don't.
No, they're dead.
They block them.
Yeah, they're
off.
dead and they cannot return.
So I think the messages that every society has things wrong. We're not perfect. We need to keep working on it, but.
I think that, I go back to my work with the women's shelter, when I worked as a chaplain in the women's shelter, and the sociologist that worked there, who wasn't a Christian, she was a nun's, you know what I mean by, like, she didn't really have.
Right.
And she just said, look, before Christians start talking about forgiveness, they need to talk about the pre-forgiveness. They need to come to terms with what it means to hold people accountable. and how to put holding people accountable together with forgiveness. Without accountability, it's not forgiveness. It's denial. It's just denial. It's just, let's let it go, let's pretend it didn't happen. And the world, I don't know, I wasn't there to hear the inner workings. The people of that Amish community did what they needed to do, right? They needed to be able to show a model of how their community deals with egregious wrong, the murder of all of their children. I did not, at the time, I did not feel like the community was given permission to appropriately respond, to rage and to say, this is awful. And instead, 2 days afterwards, they invited his mother and father, who I don't blame his mother and father, but they invited them to a picnic and sat down with them, and okay, that's good.
Right.
But I'm still not convinced that we have figured out how to put together our unbelievable and true proclamation that we can forgive and God can forgive. But you see, Isaiah, he has both elements here. He has both elements. He says, God is forgiving the people of Israel, whether you think they were guilty or not. Right. But God is forgiving them for their wayward ways, for their brutality in the world. God is forgiving them and is still going to work with them. You are my children. You're still my children. And then God is now turning to the Assyrians and saying, you cannot behave this way in the world. I'm going to see to it that your society is now destroyed. And maybe that's the foundation of war, right? I mean,
I'm sure it is.
but
I think
Yeah,
that
right.
Jesus also, though, carried on a third way. Not, he did not stay quiet when people wronged him. He spoke out. He did what he could, stopping short of violence towards another human being.
right.
But he did not stay silent. So there is another way. You don't have to, be a lamb and go quietly. You can go noisily and let your message be given, even though that message may end up being your demise, and which it turned out it was. But he was not courageous. He was certainly courageous. He just didn't take a sword and start slashing out at, or raise an army or whatever. He did it the way Gandhi did.
Yeah.
Open your mouth, say what's wrong, point out what's wrong, and stand in defiance. Don't kill in defiance, but stand against injustice. And that takes a lot of courage.
It does, and I think, it's interesting because we're coming up on the remembrance of Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, this is the hard to pin down kind of search for justice and demand for righteousness in the world that King, among others, I mean, he's outstanding personality of it, but there's a movement of people who are trying to discover what does it mean to not be someone else's doormat, to just be walked on and hope that God redeems me in the end, but to figure out a way to say no. To say, no, you will not treat me like this. You will not. We will figure out a way that is not picking up weapons of war, and you will not treat us like this because of our absolute confidence that we are children of God, and God will come to our aid in a non-violent resistance. Now, I love the picture of Martin Luther King Jr., and I admire him. I think he deserves a great and deep reverence as a human being in life. He is a Jesus type. He is. But I cannot tell you, I cannot say to you honestly that I have adopted those values in my life. When, I got into a whole lot of trouble when the Aryan nation Nazi people invaded that march in Charlottesville. And the way I got into trouble was I just honestly said, I want you to understand something. If I had been in that crowd, I would not have been peaceable. I would have been and then I had a great big rationale for it, which was, my grandfather almost died in a world war trying to stamp out Aryanism and white supremacy. And if it were to pop up right here with people who have weapons, I would take up weapons to eliminate them. And I know it's not the right solution,
Well,
but it's
one of these things that you have to really take some time to think about. Do you defend yourself? Do you defend only yourself? Do you defend the people standing next to you? How far does that go?
right.
What do you do? Do you,
What-
you know?
I think what would cause me to spring into action was if it was my daughter that had been in front of that car that got run down. I would have taken the driver out of that car and beat him till he was dead. I mean, am I allowed as a pastor to say that?
Yeah,
I'm
you
just
are.
trying to be
Oh, you
honest.
are.
I'm just trying to be
You
honest to
are.
say, look, folks, I get what I want to believe and what I think is the right thing to do, but
It's hard to do.
this is who I am. I'm actually a very passive person until I'm not. and then when I'm not, I'm embarrassingly out of control. And these issues of justice and injustice get to the core of me.
And then the idea that injustice can be acted upon 1,000 years from now?
Right.
When does it end? It reminded me when you were talking about, Isaiah's promise of 1,000 years. It reminded me of the Third Reich. Didn't they say the
1,000
same
years.
thing? Yeah. Of course, it was over in a few years, but.
Hallelujah.
Thank God it was.
Yeah.
And why was
Hallelujah.
it? Because people took up arms, and even then, narrowly, I would say, just narrowly, were they able to be victorious against a mindset that was sweeping the world, that was taking over the world and seeking to subjugate everybody else.
What's alarming now is it seems to be like a virus spreading around
It sure
the world
is.
again. I mean, there's so many of these autocratic leaders coming,
I'm trying to think of that book.
What is the appeal of that? I don't understand.
Philip Roth wrote a book about it, something of America. It's not of today, it's a few decades ago, but I've actually read it twice. And it is about people who live in Newark, New Jersey, the Jews there, and how there is this like Nazi-type movement and everything else in America. Something of America. Boy, that is awful that I
Is that the one where, imagining if the Nazis had.
If they had taken over,
Yeah,
yes.
I can't remember the name.
Yeah, but it was very like, it's like that.
threatening,
It is,
'cause it could
terribly.
easily happen.
Yeah, it could happen, and the other thing, Pastor, I was thinking is, I don't know where it is, but I know at least I'm pretty sure it's biblical. It says, "He who can master self-control is mightier than he who conquers a city." So like when you are trying to take like control of yourself, obviously it does take a lot. And that,
Yes, it
like
does.
you described that
Yeah,
situation where that young woman was actually murdered with a vehicle. And, I mean, as a father, I could understand your reaction. I could go get him. I mean,
I think the impulse of the crowd is.
thank you.
We have to do
Oh, but there were all good people there, Debbie. They were
Sure
all
they
good
were.
people.
And I don't really want to be the kind of person that just gets caught up in the moment and responds in a crowd mentality, but it's hard not to do
It's
it.
sympathetic. I can be very sympathetic towards that.
I had a conversation 3 weeks ago, which I cannot let go of. I just cannot forget it, in that I was so excited, through some connections of things, I met a new person, and I thought, this is nice. He's Greek Orthodox, and he's Greek. He has a very Greek name, and he had just returned from Greece, and he was telling me how beautiful it was, because it was during that cold snap, and he was telling me he had just been on the beach in Greece, and I was like, I'm jealous of you, and all that. And anyway, we just started talking, right? And so this is where we ended up, because I said, well, it's good to be in the kinds of places where we are, where I said, better than being in Ukraine, okay? Without pause, he looked at me and he went, I have no idea what those people in Ukraine are fighting about.
What?
Yeah, he said, I have no idea what they're fighting about. And I couldn't get my breath to begin an answer, and then he came with the second volley. He said, they're all Russians anyway. They're all Russians.
Oh,
And I don't know what the big deal
You
is.
know what, even if they were all ethnically Russians, what do you say when somebody who's that closely related to you comes at you with weapons of war? You don't,
Yeah, and also
Oh
the
my
promise of a
you're
Soviet
supposed to
society.
give in and say, okay,
Yeah,
because
which,
we're
you know,
cousins, or-
I think a society under an autocrat, under a dictator, is a terrible way to live.
And a lot of Russians feel the same way. They just haven't
Uh-huh.
been able to resist the big, you know,
Yeah,
police
that's-
state that
Yeah, that's what it
exists.
is, that
Well,
big
they're
brother
also,
state.
I think,
Afraid
they're
of
also,
falling out of a window.
they're also subjected regularly to what would life be like without the autocrat. You know, it's the murders in the cities in the West, and that democracy is a terrible way to live because it's free for all, and you can't be safe. And so then I have my own beliefs about what it means to live under a dictator like Putin. I don't care if he is elected, he's a dictator.
He's not elected.
And he has autocratic control, and that's not, to me, that is not the idea. And then, what do I think about the Ukrainian people? I think the Ukrainian people know damn well that they do not want their lives
That's right,
controlled
they don't.
by a non-elected person. But here's this man who I thought, you know, I just made this superficial assumption that, you know, a businessman here in the United States who's from Greece, who has family in Greece, he would certainly, you know and celebrate the cause of the Ukrainian people. And instead, he's like, you know, they're just killing people over there.
Well, how about somebody goes into Greece? Would he have a different feeling? I wonder, I
have
can't
an
help
idea
but
that
wonder.
he would.
Yes,
I
he
don't think
would.
he would say, you know what difference?
Yeah,
It's
what's the
living,
big
it's living.
deal?
Who cares? Who
Hey,
cares what kind of government?
I thought you were gonna say he was like, well, they're all Orthodox, so.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you
Well,
go.
he did, actually, he did make reference
Albania,
to the fact that they're all,
Macedonia, what's the
you know,
difference?
they're all
Greece?
part of the same religion, they shouldn't be
Eastern
killing each other.
Orthodox Church.
Oh, my gosh.
And so, before, I couldn't get my thoughts together.
Oh, I know.
I'm never able to do that. I have to say, my one argument with God is, couldn't you have given me the ability to respond a little more quickly to some
Oh,
things?
gosh.
And I always think about what I shoulda, woulda, coulda said after it's all over, you know, because we moved right on to talking about the fact that, well, you know, they're moving the calendar in the Orthodox Church. They moved the calendar to allow Christmas in the West to align with Christmas in the West.
Right.
And that's what we went on to talk
And
about.
you-
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even here. I mean, even
Oh,
here,
yeah?
his own parish
I know that.
was gonna be, maybe they didn't yet, but they're going to be
Because I know they were
Christmas.
celebrating, just like,
Right, they were a
yeah.
week later, I
Yeah,
think, right?
yeah.
They are a week later with Easter, that's for sure. 'cause
Yeah,
you know,
Easter.
My daughter's family, the Yorks, are, the matriarch of the family is Greek. And they-
Right.
And they have Easter, and then they have Greek Easter a week later.
Right,
It's
right.
usually a week later.
So I determined from him, after he talked a little bit,
Oh.
he wasn't really, like, he doesn't really practicing his Greek Orthodoxy. He's sort of like,
But
you
he
know,
is
I
Greek
know,
Orthodox.
But it's the religion and then there's the ethnicity thing.
Yes.
You know,
Identity, yeah.
because he was saying he just really hopes that eventually that he can celebrate Christmas with his kids when everybody else is celebrating
Oh.
Christmas with his kids. He doesn't care. He's,
So celebrated
Like,
twice.
I know.
My daughter and her family.
Yeah, I mean, that's all.
That's
Wow.
always fun.
But, yeah, I don't know. Boy, that's it. I had a, I
Lou,
want
I
to-
have a question
Yes, yes.
about if anyone can remember or know of anything. I'm thinking Margaret Mead and all the civilizations and tribes that she studied in the South Pacific. Were there any groups of people who didn't equate power with conquering others? Does anyone remember?
I don't.
Is the hope somewhere?
Barbara, was her book Blackberry Winter?
No. Margaret Mead
All right, I was
was
thinking-
she was a sociologist.
Right, yeah, I do.
1930s, there's
Yeah, I know who
whatever,
she is, but I thought there was a book
anthropologist,
out.
and she went to different places in the
Yes.
South.
And cultures and all.
So
Right.
I'm answering out of ignorance, but let me just say, from the little bit I have learned, weren't there and aren't there still cultures of people, indigenous people here in the North American continent, who we call, Native Americans, for whom their very existence as society was nonviolent. They lived to be, they had a sense that nature, every time they had to kill a deer, they had to say a prayer before they killed the deer and thanked God for allowing that deer to volunteer to come forward to where their arrows could hit them. And that those people, in and of their very nature, were not they were not tribal in the sense of needing to be in control of other tribes.
Right.
But, and honestly, I actually think
Bless
that
you.
if you look at the originating stories of the Hebrews who had suffered under the domination of the Egyptians, that their first identity of themselves was that they were going to be that kind of people. They were going to be the people who were a blessing. They had received a blessing. It seems to me, whenever they refer to the law of Moses, when the foundation of the law was this: everything that is lawful or not lawful springs out of the fact that you got everything you got as a gift from God. That was to be the foundation of the formation of a people, a chosen people who would know and who would rehearse every morning and every night that I am who I am, that I have received everything that I have received as a gift, not of myself. And why? Because that would make them a people who would move out into the world where there's all kinds of brokenness and hatred and hostility, and that they would respond differently in the circumstances of the world. But, and I usually tell the story this way, as they tried to live that out, they found that the world was a meaner place than they expected. The enemies of their neighbors, you call it first strike. Like, they would raise crops, they would make their crops available to people who were having trouble, and and then people would find out they had wheat stores and things, and they would raid and invade, and they would take what would have been offered to them for free. And so the warringness of their neighbors, for a while, during the period of the judges, the story at least is told, that they were able to organize militias to defend themselves, right? They were not going out but they would stop that kind of invasion by getting a militia together and defeating those people who wanted to steal what belonged to the people so that they would then whatever. Okay, so that goes on for a while, and then the people say this is ridiculous. We keep organizing to defend ourselves. Let's go wipe out those invading people. Go beyond our boundaries. Don't just push them out of our country. Let's go. And who do we need to do that? We need a king. So here we are back to the same loop of the story. We need a king. And Samuel says you don't need a king. You need to depend upon God more and suffer the losses and then receive the blessing of God. The crops will be bigger next year. Let's live that way. And the people say, no, we don't want to live that way. And so Samuel says, okay, are you ready to have your sons die in battle?
Yeah.
And they say, yes, we are. We're ready for it. Because we need an army and we need a king. And why? And the argument is, because we look at other nations, how do other nations survive? Well, they survive because they have warring, organized, trained soldiers. And I wish at that point there had been some people to stand up and go, let's go investigate that. Let's go see how that works. Is it Costa Rica? I think it's Costa Rica who does not have an army. They do not have an army, and they never have had an army. And somebody posted, on those things that come up, I'm a mother from Costa Rica, and I'm grateful that my son will never be drafted into an army that my nation doesn't have.
The Swiss don't have an army either. I'm looking up peaceful societies. There are some, believe it or not, spread throughout the Amazon basin. There were groups of people, of course, they were so peaceful, they met with a terrible end because they were taken advantage of. But the people of Mauritius, they said to this day, they're very careful in how they act with one another, and they don't, they're careful what the press covers and how it covers things to not get people upset
get
with
inflamed?
each other. Exactly.
Yes.
And then they mentioned Switzerland, which I guess during the Second World War, it must have been really hard not to take sides, but
Right.
they managed pretty much to do that, and I don't think they do have a standing army.
And how, so, okay, so let's talk about Switzerland, right? Because we always use that in my family as, oh, I'm gonna be
Yeah,
Switzerland in
that's
this.
right, right.
But so, okay, so Switzerland was neutral. Do you really want people to be neutral in the face of the gas ovens and all the brutality? Do you really want to say, well, I'm not gonna take sides in this? No, you need to take sides. This, again, I'm not saying this is the biblical point of view. I'm just saying, it's just my human nature to say, you gotta take sides. You cannot remain neutral.
You have to decide what is a just war then.
Right.
Yes, and that's the whole thing, right? The just war theory, like,
Right.
Yeah.
which I think most of that has gone way into the history books, because nobody cares about fighting a just war anymore, and I mean nobody. I still can't help it. I mean, I can disclose that, you know, I was thrilled when Obama was elected president. I never expected that he would be the president that would give the yes to drones being fired out of the sky and killing people who did not have a trial, who had not been convicted of any crime, but that on the word of the Secret Service, these were enemies of the state and they needed to be killed. And I want to go, okay, what in the world has happened? And I know it's a different world. Things have changed, and they've changed in ways that are so complex, I cannot understand them. But
Yeah.
the principle of,
I think, you know, Graham Greene's The Third Man, that book, movie, has the character who's evil saying, you know, the Swiss are wonderful because they're not, you know, they don't war with anybody else. But what has Germany given us? All this technology, wonderful, you know, science, and what have the Swiss given us? Cuckoo clocks.
yeah.
And I always remember that line.
That's great.
Of course, it's an exaggeration.
Right, right.
You know, Switzerland.
And chocolate.
And
That's
chocolate.
right. And chocolate.
Okay,
Let's
that's it.
not forget, and fondue.
Okay, there you
I
go.
think geography may help Switzerland to stay neutral because they had all these, there's
Right.
a lot of different things. It's not only the nature of the people.
I still cannot believe that the Nazis just didn't go right through. I mean, what did they care? They really didn't. You talk about fair war.
Something
Push decline. Just push decline, the red button.
The big one.
Okay. I mean, it was unbelievable that they didn't, to me. I mean, because they didn't, I mean, what did they?
They didn't go
They had
through
no-
who?
Why didn't they just go get Switzerland? I mean, it would
It's
have, nothing.
Cuckoo clocks and
That's right. I mean, it would be
chocolate, though.
nothing. It would be nothing for them to have done that. They did
But
all the
strategically,
low
it wasn't-
countries.
Right,
Yeah, they didn't need
They
it.
could come back around and get them
Right.
after they beat the rest
Sure.
of the world.
And they didn't have an army. So,
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, so they're not worth
Well, neither,
going after.
obviously, neither really did Poland either, in not 39, so, because they just walked right in,
But our enemies are also moving targets because
right?
Japan and Germany now are our super friends.
Yeah, there you go, Barbara.
And they just fought off an attempt to take over their government.
Yeah,
It's going all over the place now. It's just,
nothing has
maybe
changed.
the Nazis were right. Maybe they will be around for 1,000 years. Who knows?
Well,
They're
they're
here.
proving their resilience, I can say
They're
that.
here.
I gotta check the battery in that other microphone. Feels like it's gone quiet. Bear with me for a second. Nope. It's
Drink
still
of
on.
water.
Okay. I just have to be able to see
There's
that.
a light on.
Where's that green dot?
Yeah, it's coming around.
Here it
Okay,
is.
all right, I just have
All
to be
right.
able to see that. So Isaiah says, God is on the side in this case, God is on the side of God's people who have been oppressed. They have been trampled on as a nation has trampled them into the ground. And earlier, the prophets seemed to say, and they deserved it. I'm sorry, I mean, that's kind of, you can extract out of this the story. People cried out, why is this happening to us, God? Well, look around you. You have been the most terrible nation in the world. You have abused your neighbors. You have taken the spoils of war. You are not God's people. So, I don't know you. There's a part where God says, I don't even know you. I look at you and I don't know you. How could you ever expect that I would favor you, that I would sustain you? I will not. So the Assyrians come, the theologians are asked, why is this happening? And the theologians say, are you kidding me? Now it's happening to you. This is what happens to every other nation. You are no different than any other one. You abuse, you will be destroyed. And so Assyria then comes and raids and invades, and some of the theologians say, well, this is what God said God would do if you didn't live according to, quote, the law of God. You're not long on this earth. And then Isaiah comes along and says, well, but God is a forgiving God and will not destroy you entirely. So, out of a small remnant, a small remaining group of people who can still trace their lineage, and I think this is still bloodlines, can trace their lineage to Jesse and to David and to others, God will figure out a way to reignite you as a community and to repopulate you on the earth. And that's good news, right? And in the meantime, those who oppressed you will now be squashed like bugs.
And can't you feel good about that?
Yeah, don't you feel good? They're going to get theirs.
Really? I don't know. Sitting far removed from all the ills of the warring world, it's easy to go, oh, you would never want revenge. But, come on, we're all human. So I don't know. I guess you would have to experience it to understand how you would feel.
Right.
Well, and I've often used those comments just because we haven't ventured into enough controversial area yet. I use those comments to talk just in plain language about the people we call the Palestinian people. I don't mean anything anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish by it. I have just said this. If my grandfather, he was a German, he had a farm, he had 180 acres of land in southeastern Pennsylvania, and if a nation, any group of people came into the area that was his land and told him that because of some historical whatever, this land was no longer his, that it was going to be taken from him and his crops would be cut down, my grandfather would have become a terrorist. He would have. He would have said, over my dead body.
Or at the very least, insist on trying to reclaim in some way, perhaps peacefully, but speaking out, acting out in ways that hopefully don't hurt other people, but you can only do that for so long,
Right.
and then people get really upset. My friend Mediha that I was talking about, her family was displaced from the Golan Heights by the '67 war, and she still talks about, I'd love to go back where our farm was, I'd love to see it, but you can grow out of that need to for vengeance.
Oh, avenge, right, to avenge.
Because she's always looking to meet with Jews and Christians
Right.
and do interfaith projects, and so there's this idea that you can heal from stuff like that and forgive. And she talks about her father, who would not leave when the Israelis pointed guns at him because he had animals and he couldn't abandon them and let them die. And he stayed till he was able to sell them to Jewish settlers who were going to come
And take over his land.
Right? And then he finally left to be with his family in Syria. That's where they ended up having to move to Damascus. But, and when he was there, she said he was a very peaceful man. He tried to help other refugees that were coming, even though he was a refugee. How do you do that as a person who's been so wronged? And the Palestinian people that I know, and I know quite a bit of them because my mosque is predominantly Palestinian, and they almost all the families know exactly where they had their homes. Some of them still can, point to certain trees on the property. They go back to visit family who still live in the area but are stopped at every damn checkpoint.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
And yet, okay, some people are bitter still, but most of the people are like, someday we'll be able to visit peacefully. I mean,
Right.
it's almost like, how do you do that and move on?
There was a Presbyterian church through it, I forget what the acronym stood for, it was a conversation for peace between Palestinians and the Jews, and they did a film following several people with stories like yours, and the one film of a Palestinian family that identified a Jewish family who was living in their house, and they traveled back to the house just to meet the people, and they struck up an arrangement where they shared the house.
Really?
They actually shared the house. It had something to do with a lemon tree, because it
I know
was
that.
traced to a lemon tree that was in the backyard, and that in conversations they said, yes, come and see the lemon tree, and then they began to talk, and they the argument is, if it was left to the people, they could negotiate.
Figure it out.
They would figure it out. They understand that history has landed them in a place that seems to make them enemies, but that as people, they're not enemies. And there is a movement, even in Israel today and in Palestine today, for cooperation and conversation, but nations have a hard time with this. Nation states do not like this. I don't know
The
why.
bureaucracy has to sit down and make the laws on paper, and when you do that, it's not flexible.
No, it's not.
That's what happens. Trees seem to have a lot of importance in that area of the world, maybe because it's arid
And they're scarce.
but to the Palestinian people, the olive trees were the source of sustenance, and to this day, to make way for illegal
Settlements,
Israeli settlements, they cut down these centuries-old olive trees.
Oh, no.
So it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
it's like maybe killing the buffalo.
Yes.
Were to the
Right. It's
indigenous
very
people.
symbolic,
Yeah.
yes.
It's because in these disputed territories, the Israeli government does not want a strong population of people they perceive as a threat to them.
Nuisance.
So they're going to they need new housing. They need new housing to rebuild the nation of Israel. I get it. But where do they go? They go into these incursions in the disputed territories, and they build these big housing developments and pay people to come there, to live there.
Time the people coming there are coming from here.
They're coming from here.
They're not Israelis.
No, and they're living
They've never
on-
set foot there until
Yep.
And they're living on stipends that are provided by the United States to the Israeli government for restitution that goes all the way back to World War II. I get it. It's a
Yep.
very complex.
It's just
Yes.
craziness.
It's not an easy story.
But
No,
in
it's
the mill of ideas and world, there are individuals who are living. So here we see the big wheels turning, right? The Assyrians and the Israelites and all the rest of that again. And then somebody decides, where do you apply the name God to what's happening here? And God is faithful. Okay, that's what we want to hold on to. God will not, because we've been disobedient and we've been violent and we've been, territory mongers and we've stolen as a people from other people. Yes, we've done the opposite of who we're supposed to be. But ultimately, what Isaiah says is, but God is not going to disown you. God will not disown you. And God will see to it that there remains a line, and in some ways, the theologians in the Bible argue that it's God protecting God's reputation. Like, God chose you. And so you need to survive. For God's sake, you need to survive. You need to carry forward the remnant that God can do a good work of ministry and blessing in the world.
I hope to think that God feels that we're all peoples.
Yes.
And we're all redeemable, and all culpable and redeemable at the same time.
And I think that in some ways, that's what the Jesus movement began to do. You know, Paul expanding the message of the chosen people of God beyond Jewish people and moving out into the
For
world
Jew and
to say,
Gentile, right.
you are all the children of God. And so the commission that is given to the Hebrew people to live as a blessing is also a commission given to you because you are the children of God. And in some ways that was, especially in the first century, that was the explosive Christian, if you will, message. That was the way. That was the new idea that turned the world upside down. And I think in the first, second, and third centuries, it was contagious. It was catching on. There, like, you know, tribe and race and all of it doesn't mean anything or nearly as much as the identity of God, who is the Lord, if you will, to use the feudal language of the English society, but who is the sovereign. And again, there we got the language of kings, but that God is the source, the beginning and the end of all of our life, and we are all sisters and brothers in a family created by God. This message broke out in the world population and moved, almost like population itself, out into the world. And what I don't understand is what happened. By the time you get to the 3rd century, and Rome now, the Emperor of Rome, becomes Christian, and he baptizes all of the people of Rome as if you're now Christian whether you want to be or not. And you know, again, contemporary theologians talk about the day Christendom, that the kingdom of Christ had come in the arm of the Roman government. How do you put that together? But that happened in 3rd century. And when the emperor converted, if you will, to some version of Christianity and made it illegal not to be Christian.
Well, there you have it.
Right there.
Again, the extreme, it's just carrying on a tribal mentality. And I think when the Prophet Muhammad came after, he also said the same thing Jesus did. We are inviting everyone. There's no one that should be left out. Come. When you start forcing people, and in the time of the Prophet, it was said, there's no compulsion in religion. If you don't accept it, that's fine. We'll still find a way to deal with you. After he was gone, successive generations, then all of a sudden, you've got a bureaucracy again to run, and you've got commerce and armies and different things, and then all of a sudden, these rules become not theological, they become commercial.
That's right.
And for reasons of commerce and power, people read different things into the message, and that pollutes it. When Malcolm X went to Mecca, the big surprise for him, who adopted Islam through the Nation of Islam, which is very, racist.
Yeah.
He went to Mecca and saw people from all over the world worshiping peacefully together, white people, black people, people from Europe, people from the Far East, and it was like a revelation, and he said, I can't believe in that racist iteration of Islam. I believe in Orthodox Islam that says, come, all of you, and coexist together, which was Jesus's revolutionary message. And of course that caused a lot of problem. I mean, you can't run
Rock
an
the boat.
empire if
That's
you
right.
got people feeling, sympathetic to people who could be your enemies.
Yeah, and again, the tension is ours here in our country, and I feel like as a pastor, I feel like sometimes I should take a stronger stand that Christianity is not a nation. It's not, it cannot be a nation. It cannot. And I have, again, as if I haven't got myself in enough trouble.
Talk to Ms. Green in our
Well, I know, but see, I don't believe that the American flag belongs in the Christian building.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it belongs here.
Well-
I don't think it
Your
belongs.
predecessor also tried to put it in the other room.
Yeah, I mean, pastors have
Until
been
people
fired. I
complain.
have friends who
Yep.
lost their positions in churches because in the Second World War, in order to show support and solidarity for the struggle against the Nazis, it was then that churches said, we're going to show that we are in solidarity with the nation of America, and they brought the flags in, and they put them right up on the platforms.
They did.
And they did so for reasons I understand.
Right, exactly.
But in the world we live in today, the church, its property, needs to be like an embassy. It's an embassy that flies one
It
flag.
has to be universal. It
Yeah.
can't narrow it.
But-
It's so true, and I love my country. I salute
Right.
the flag when appropriate, but I don't think it's appropriate in the church building for the reason that
It's
you
not.
just said. You cannot have a
not.
universal communion of people if
That's right.
everybody's got their own flag. It's just not
That's
gonna
right.
happen.
And
Well, and that's why I said, if you want to fly a flag, you got to fly them all. You got to be like the United Nations.
that's right.
You can
That's the
say, we
truth.
are a church of many nations.
It's not gonna
There's
be a lot of room
when
left.
I drive down to Patterson, there is a church whose name is the Church of Many Nations. And I always want to stop, and I want to go in, and I want to see, how do you do this?
Yeah.
How do you say, this is a church of many nations, without anyone thinking you're being disloyal to
America.
America, to
That's right.
to the nation, land
And that's what
on
would
which it's
happen.
planted. But it's this question of God and the people, and what is revealing about the way people are, and what is revealing about the way God is. I think that we get used to hearing some of the most radical statements that are stored in the Bible. When Paul says, in Christ, in Jesus Christ, there is neither Greek nor Jew.
Right.
And there is neither male nor female. And so that is a direct quote from the Apostle Paul, who we say is the foundation of all of our understanding of theology. So it seems to me that in Paul's time, he was dealing with this thing of nationalism and of race and of culture and of gender, all of it. He was dealing with all of it. And he declared that the existence and the tradition of Jesus Christ reduced all of that to second and third concerns.
And yet he goes on, and knowing he is going to be dealing with a lot of different people with different ideas and wanting everybody to coalesce into an organized bureaucracy, he says, well, you ladies, you should be quiet in church. A lot of different things he says is not in line with that. And I think that's a very human thing. I mean, it's great to say something ideological, but when you actually have to put something into practice, it gets harder.
I think, again, I've often defended Apostle Paul on the comment he made about women. The early church was so inclusive that it was very difficult to figure out, okay, so who are we, what are we going to believe? And one of the groups that they were inclusive of was the temples of the temples of worship, of the variety of religion, and
Right.
in which there were a lot of women who were priestesses.
That's right.
Right.
They were
They were
priestesses.
apostles. And,
Well, wait, no. Before they were apostles, before Jesus came along, they were priestesses
Oh, I
in
see.
their own religions.
oh, I get it.
And what I think Paul is arguing against is, what Jesus is about is not saying everything is game. He's trying to say, like you said, he's trying to organize what are the principles, because the experience of the church was chaotic. They had feasts, and it was the first time ever there was a feast in which y'all come. Everybody comes. Everybody comes. The Roman soldiers were coming. The prostitutes from the temple were coming, and they weren't. They were prostitutes, and there were people, priestesses from all the other. The movement of Jesus was the most earth-shattering, all one people. And Paul, I think sometimes he loses sight of things things, but I think his argument to say, in the Jewish tradition, men were the only ones who were educated. They were the only ones who could read. They were the only ones who could really be thought of as being able to teach. When he says to the women, I think you need to go home and you need to be quiet in the context of this new religion, is we are not that. We're not a temple of the priestesses. Now that's my defense of him, because he could not have possibly thought that women were not able to teach him, because he names 3 women
Right.
who taught
Okay.
him everything
Right.
that he believed about Jesus. So I don't think it was women in general. I think he was speaking to the community to say, look, I know you were leaders in your faith traditions. You need to be quiet, and you need to hear something new about who Jesus was, and give us a chance to teach that. Now, I know that's not how it washes out.
No, it doesn't.
And I think also translators who were in favor of women being quiet have not helped.
And that's how they got the early Catholic Church, got the idea that you cannot be a priest, you cannot serve the
You
community,
can't talk, you
cannot
can't do anything.
If you're female, you can be a teacher in an elementary school, or you can be a nurse, or you can serve us dinner
What was
and clean
acceptable.
the house, but you can't do anything.
In the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which is,
Yeah.
women are never allowed to teach children.
Really?
Not even Sunday school, huh? Because the Baptists let you teach Sunday school to a certain age, so.
And there are some Missouri Synod churches that will allow women to teach children, again, up to a certain age, or they'll allow women to teach girls.
Right.
But they will not allow a woman to teach Sunday school to a boy.
Okay.
You know, in our American mosques, there's a variety of different things, but generally, women do not. They're not the leaders. They're not going to lead the prayer if they're men in the prayer.
Right.
So that's why the imams are always going to be men.
Right.
Women can lead other women in prayer. Women can teach.
Other women?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, women
and
can.
women can teach little boys, and
Oh.
yeah. And generally, by the time the kids get to like teenage years,
Yeah.
there's usually always a man teaching. But early on, it's all because it's difficult to round these little kids up. You need a woman to do, right?
You do.
But I'm kidding. But there are mosques in Canada now. Of course, the Canadians are not orthodox. They do whatever they damn well please. That they have women imams, a couple of them.
Wow.
And it's always a source of huge controversy. It's like, these things change slowly, glacially, if they change at all, ever.
But at some point, and this is all I care about, is that we go, okay, so you want to be conservative. You want the good old religion, right? Mm-hmm. The good old religion is not that. That's why I try to argue, let's go back then. Let's go back to the fundamentals.
That has been the argument of feminists in Islam, because they say, let's go back. Prophet ﷺ, his wife, Aisha, was so knowledgeable about her husband's sayings and what he did and what he didn't do, and that a lot of times when he had to be out on the road someplace, and the people said, well, you're going to be gone. If we have questions that come up, who do we ask? Ask Aisha. She knows. Isn't that an idea that, it would be okay to listen to the
Historical.
women?
Sure,
Let's go back
that's
to the
right.
fundamentals.
Let's do
But
it.
somewhere it gets changed when people have different ideas.
And so, as a child growing up, what I adopted as a thinking, learning, then young theologian was, I'm a fundamentalist. Let's go back to the and what I didn't know were what were the originals.
That's right.
When learning and through theologians and through historical study, when I've learned that, I sound like a conspiracy theorist, when I learned that about the 4th or 5th century, a worldwide movement of male domination, which was never a part of the Christian movement, it moved into the Christian church, it moved into the communities of the dinners, it moved in, and it began to be that, here's the key, women were removed from leadership. They were removed from leadership. And so what if, when we're fighting, people, oh, well, the church, it's drifted off to liberalism and whatever, that's what women being present means. What was that thing? I'd like to get an ounce of the liquid that was in the world at the time of the 4th century that allowed all the fundamentals of the Christian movement to be eroded. It was taken over when Constantine declared that Christianity was a Roman religion. What they brought with it was, and I love Christmas, sort of. But what they brought with it was, when Constantine declared that Rome was Christian, I'm not sure which took over which, because that's when we got the birth of Jesus on the 25th of December.
Right.
Because they were trying to force the Roman society away from that self-understanding, and they were trying to force into the Roman consciousness a version of what it meant to be Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. And so they exchanged. December 25th was
Right.
the emperor's birthday.
So
It was
whoopee!
Saturnalia too. Was that
Yeah, well,
a big feast?
it's related to Saturnalia, but
Right.
you know how when the Pope becomes Pope, his name is no longer his name, but it becomes the new name? It was also true of the emperors of Rome. But when the emperor became emperor, his birthday, and he was born on June 21. Nope, no longer. His birthday
Now
was
it's-
moved to the time of the seasons of the sun. And what you see happening is the Roman Greek culture had a religion that was honed and well-tuned, and it was related to the emperor is the sun god. It wasn't the emperor is the emperor is God. And so what happens is the power of the theology of Rome begins to take over this fledgling, still, even after 300 or 400 years,
Sure.
it's still a fledgling
It's a baby.
society. They haven't even organized the Bible yet. You don't have a definitive word of what is authoritative, so you've got chaos in theology and in teaching. But one of the things we now know is women were a very big part of communities who called themselves people of the way. And the way was a way that was inclusive of women, it was inclusive of Roman soldiers, it was inclusive of foreigners from all over the world. It was a global community that was gathering around, it almost sounds like a hippie movement.
Yeah.
Was gathering around the idea of the love of God, demonstrated in Jesus, which leads us to be loving people. That was foreign to the way of the Romans.
That doesn't work for very long.
It doesn't work for Roman society. Roman society was not based on that.
Well, the letters,
Yeah,
is
there they are.
Paul trying to, okay, you people, let me try and tell you what I think you need to hear. And then the next letter comes from some other group of people that has maybe the opposite idea. Well, let's try. It's all compromises
It is.
already from
It
the
is,
time
yes.
of Paul.
Right.
When did the Jews have to compromise celebrating their cultural heritage, like their, from the Old Testament? Like when to be considered Christian? How did that work with the Jews?
Well, if you want to read that drama is recorded in the book of Acts.
Okay.
So if you read in the book of
Right,
Acts, you'll
right.
see the clash between.
Was through Pentecost and all of that?
Yeah,
or-
and it was really about circumcision.
Right.
Do non-Jews have to be circumcised to become Christian? And Peter and Paul have a big breakdown argument over that until Peter has his dream, and they give in and they argue that no, Christianity. This is the key.
Right.
Christianity in the book of Acts moves from the legality of the concreteness of the traditions, and they spiritualize everything so we can all be together.
Hallelujah.
And they talk about the circumcision of the heart. What was circumcision? It was a physical mark on a body that meant you belong to God. And so what happens is,
Caused a lot of deaths.
well, and in order to find peace, they negotiate and they actually allow that baptism is the mark. And by the way, baptism leaves no mark. Like,
Oh, there's no indelible mark on my
no,
soul?
no.
Oh, okay.
So the baptism becomes the acceptable means that unites all these people together, Jews and Christians and people who want to be part of the people of the way. So there are two things that unite the community, according to the book of Acts. One was baptism and the meal.
Right, okay.
A meal. As simple as we eat together. We sit together and we eat together, and that means that we are sustained by the same God who provides all the meals for the world. And so that community is rolling along. It's growing. and its leaders, yes, Paul was one of the leaders, but I can't think of her name right now, but the one woman who was in the cave drawings, who was etched as her head was higher than Paul, and she's named by Paul. There are 3 women that are named by Paul as his mentors who gave him, I'm convinced, they're the ones who gave him a way to stand against his sectarian rejecting of anyone who doesn't say the creed that I say. He was conditioned away from that to that statement, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, not in Christ, all that is gone, we are one people. You know, we must find a way of being together in the world as the children of God. And who, I think, the women were the one who explained that to him, who helped him to see that that was ultimately the breakout. It was the takeaway from the life of Jesus. And that Jesus died for all. He didn't just die for 5 branches of the right, correct group of people. He died for the whole world. So the universal message of Christ is exploding out of the first century. It's exploding. And it's moving from one language to another. You know, in Acts they talk about there were 5,000 people added. And obviously language and culture were not a barrier, because on Pentecost, they all seem to understand. Yeah, Route 23 Honda really was there. They all seem to understand that there is a core message which is bigger than any of their language or their culture or their identity. Yeah. And they're drawn to it.
Well, and too bad it's not that way now.
Right.
We find, minutia to divide us, and it's in every religion.
It seems to be the drift.
I mean, in Islam, there's circumcision still.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's the drift of human beings toward that kind of thing. I mean, I try to refrain from re-preaching my sermon. But, on Sunday I talked about how I had been in several churches and cathedrals that have stained glass windows, and all the symbols and signs that are etched in the windows, and how many of them have the sword, they have the shield, but that in many ways, the text on Sunday invites us to take one sign only. Jesus was baptized, and the sign that appeared was a dove. It was a dove. It was a dove that descended from heaven, and I don't know why it just came up. These scientists were doing an experiment, and they were recording the sounds of birds flying. And what was amazing was, it wasn't the dove, but it was the owl. You know that an owl flies and makes absolutely no sound.
Boy, with those big old wings,
No
amazing.
sound. They showed it on, in the charts. They had the owl flying across. They had a pigeon flying, and the sound thing is going all up and down. They did have a dove that flew, but doves
Pigeons
make noise
make a
when
lot
they
of
fly.
Pigeons make a lot of noise, so doves would too,
Doves
for
make
sure.
a lot. They make a whistling sound when
yeah.
they fly. But the owl, the owl comes in.
Quiet because they're pouncing on prey.
Yes,
That's
and-
right.
And they're
Not
like,
that
their
peaceful.
wings are flapping, but there is not, they turned the sensitivity of the listening devices up, and they cannot detect the sound of the wind moving. It moves, and I think maybe we should have
cute.
been, maybe the owl should have been our
Right.
way, right?
The dove.
Making no noise.
Just or at least a dove, at least a dove. But instead,
sword.
you know, you have people who think the bird of Christ is the hawk, you know, is the warrior,
Right.
Right.
is the one who's going to.
Because it's not matrilineal, it's patriarchal.
Yeah.
Guys like guys, let's
Yes.
pick the tall guy to be the king. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, there you go.
Let's pick the one that looks like Thor. Let's make him king.
which lady are you thinking of now? I'm looking it up. Priscilla, Lydia?
Priscilla
Yeah.
is one of them. I
Yeah.
think it was Priscilla.
Lydia and Aquila.
Right. Aquila and
Right,
Priscilla
right.
and Lydia. And I think it is Priscilla who, at least in the, so the extra biblical historical stuff that goes on, Josephus writes about the church. He's Jewish,
Right.
but he writes about the church experiences, and he talks about these women. Women that the church doesn't even know of. But he's writing about their
The
influence.
church knew
Didn't know.
about them.
They
just
dropped
took-
them.
They want not to tell you about them or to dwell on them too much because you would say, well, then why aren't women in
That's
the
right.
hierarchy? I mean, they also contributed money to the,
Oh,
they
I
had
think,
means of their
I think
own.
the evidence shows that Jesus existed. He did not have to go to work and go fishing. He existed because of patrons. His patrons were women who were women of wealth, who saw to it. He had an entourage that had to travel.
That's right.
They had to stay places. They, you know, Mary and Martha are thought of as maybe being women that had means. And that the story of Jesus staying with them didn't answer the question, well, where'd the rest of his entourage stay? And as he moved into towns and villages, they had to stay someplace. They had to provide money for the food. And women were responsible for this.
Who's responsible for hospitality?
Yeah.
Hospitality committee is always who wants to be on hospitality? But without it, you kind of like, you're
It's
not,
the preeminent sign of the church. It is the,
as Jesus and the disciples moved, they had to depend on the hospitality of the people.
Yep.
And, okay, men provided means, but sometimes women did too, and the women did the work. You're gonna eat, who's gonna cook? The ladies are gonna cook.
and yet when the
And they're going
apostle,
to clean it all up, too.
but when the apostle Paul is writing to the early church and the chaos of the early church, and they have these dinners, the big thing Paul writes about is he goes, first of all, let's have some manners at dinner. You cannot have the people who arrive first eating all the food. Like, I mean, it's as practical as you can get.
That's great. I
You
like
cannot.
it.
This
That
the
is
table
really
of
good.
Christ. It's like he writes that in, I think is it Corinthians? And he says, look, you gotta show some manners. This is the community of Jesus Christ. You have to wait. And the
I
people
like
were
it.
arriving, and then he also says that one of the things you probably ought to do is you ought to eat a meal first before you come to the love feast. Because you're eating so much, there isn't enough for everybody. I mean, these are the practical concerns.
This is
And
like
then,
the loaves and the fishes.
right, and
Right.
then he gets on to what becomes, you know, one theology professor said, Jesus left the church hilariously unstructured.
Right.
He had not one word about how his followers should be
He did not-
structured.
His mission wasn't to
No,
make a
he
church.
That's
didn't
right.
see an organization. He saw individuals who were following in the walk of God, walk in the way of God. So Paul comes along and he goes, look, we have got to organize this meal thing. And so he says, well, I want half of you, raise your hands, half of you, and I want you to be deacons. And what was the work of the deacons? It was not, okay, you be the women, and then the men will do the, no. Paul says, you will be called to a vital ministry, which was what? Setting the table, seeing to it that the food is prepared and ready to go. That's the diaconate. It's the caring for the good of the community.
Now nobody wants to be a deacon, everybody wants to be on the finance committee.
Yeah,
Well, and then
right.
because he says, and then there are elders, the elders need to go to a different work. It's a division of labor, but he's very clear to say not one is more important than the other.
Right.
And so what happens as the church moves through the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, all of a sudden the women are setting the table and clearing off, because that's what we'll do with them, keep them busy, and then the men can go off to secret rooms and they can make decisions and they can make the right decision.
Make deals.
It is not, I keep arguing, it is not then about, that is not conservative Christianity. Conservative Christianity cares more about what it originally was.
it's not fundamentalism at all.
It's not fundamentalism.
Right.
It's not. It's actually quite
Different.
liberal in terms of the way it just did whatever it wanted to do. But I can't, there's nobody listening to that today. They're not. No one really, I mean, and I know myself, going through it in seminary and coming to terms with it, it's like, I feel lied to. I feel like no one, in all the effort to say we're gonna conserve the kernel of the kerygma of the truth of the gospel, that the people who were behind what we actually have now as the conservative kerygma, the kernel, the nut of it all, they were not interested in preserving what was. They weren't. They made it convenient for themselves. And that's what liberals are accused of doing today, right?
Convenient.
We changed the gospel.
Well, I
And
think
to
the
make sure it
gospel's
left a
always
lot out.
changing in situations. Jesus said, in this situation, you follow the law. In this situation, use your own judgment. Do you let somebody die, or do you...
Uh-huh.
Right.
Jesus himself said, the law changes as the situation changes. So what makes it, what was that?
What does that say? Oh, that's somebody inviting me to lunch.
Oh, you have to go.
No, I cannot go.
Oh.
So doesn't that mean that, things change and we can accept change where when your brain says it's not smart to do otherwise? I mean,
Well, I think that someone once said that Christianity is unique as a religion because into each new generation that it moves, somehow it has had enough flexibility ultimately to embrace the change of our society. Our society is nothing like the ancient world society, but somehow a version of Christianity still survives, and there's still a connective tissue between that. My concern is that as it moves from one incarnation to the next, is it possible for the entire, well, that phrase, they throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
Is it possible that as we try to clean off the trappings of a culture and preserve the kernel of what is the message, that there are times maybe where we risk that what we think of as the real original message is actually part of the trappings of the culture? And that we have maybe lost a lot of the kernel of the truth. And in scholarship, they call what I'm talking about the kerygma. The kerygma, the core, what is the core message?
Yeah.
And that's why I keep trying to come back to say, I think the core message of the Hebrew Scriptures, and I can't talk for all Jews, but to start with the call and the commission to Abram and Sarah. Blessing, be a blessing to the families of the earth. I will defend you, and you will live in peace, and you will
Maybe heal the world.
heal the world. Be the bridge, stand in the gap. Be the people that make a difference and live not in response to the way the world is, but live in response to the way God is.
I think that message goes through all three of the Abrahamic religions.
I have come to know that I believe that is true as well.
Right. What are you gonna do?
We don't carry it out much.
In Islam, a lot of the encounters like this, called the halakha that we go to, there's often talk between what is cultural, what is the core of the religion, how do you reconcile the two, what do you ignore, what do you bring forward, and as centuries go by, it's hard to remember what wasn't, what wasn't part of the religion, what was merely cultural, and why are you still doing and that's never going to end. People get really upset about all this stuff because
Like they
so
want.
the original idea, like everyone come together and worship together peacefully, becomes, well, you don't do it that way. You put your hands here. No, you put your hands here. No, we do that, and
Yeah, all these little things. Like there's so many, like the conservatives, I feel like, want this country to be the white Christian United States of America.
And their idea was that's the way the
That's-
founding fathers wanted
Oh,
it.
they
But if
believe
you read
that.
what the founding fathers wrote, they did not want that.
They-
They wanted just the
And
opposite.
the funny thing is, like, when you look into our founding fathers, many of them were Unitarian.
Yes,
So-
but you know, there's debates about, you say, when you look into it. It's like, we like to think that you can go back to an objective history.
Yeah, I
You
know we
find that
can't.
You can't,
You
you know, you
can't.
can't. And then
You
there are
can't do
arguments
that.
you know, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they actually, you know, they believed in a Christian nation. like that
Ben
would
Franklin
tolerate
believed in
others.
himself.
All right, we need to,
Okay, we gotta
we
go.
started late, so we ended late.
Whoa, there we
But
go.
I'm really happy that we had this time together.
Oh, let's sing it.
Yes.
Thank you, Pastor.
You're welcome. And we'll see you next week. All right, Colette?
Bye, Barbara.
Do we
Glad-
use the same for Tuesday nights?
No, there's a separate invitation for the Tuesday night Zoom, but I did not
Okay.
have it. I didn't have the meeting last night because I was still at a hospital in New York City. So
Yeah,
So
I'm
I'll
praying
give you-
for
I'll give
your
you the.
father-in-law.
We usually send out a reminder of, but you could use the exact same invitation from Tuesday night every night when Tuesday comes.
Okay,
All right?
I just wondered if you had bundled those two together or not.
No, they were bundled.
Okay.
They were bundled in the last message, just in the line, but they're still two separate
Okay.
invitations. Okay,
Okay,
All right.
bye,
Have
everybody.
a good week till we meet
Bye.
again. Bye.
Bye, bye, Barbara.
Bye, Barbara.
Bye-bye.
Barbara down in Florida.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Florida must be.
Let me turn this stuff
Oh,
off
all right.
first before I forget.
Yeah, I just have one thing that I wanted to say to you.
Just one?
Yeah, just one.
I usually have 1,000
Yeah,
things I'd
like,
like to
yeah,
say.
especially after Bible study, it drives me nuts, right? Think,